Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last of our four-part series, Mental Resiliency in Challenging Times. Again, thank you for staying with us. And also as a reminder that the recordings of all four webinar sessions will be available at our Cal-HOSA website, which you can see on the screen, calhosa.org. And Dr. Reagan's title for this webinar, Coming Back Stronger, is timely and one that I think turns the focus back on us, and that is how will we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic? What narrative will we write that captures our experiences for these past 3 months? And what will our story be, or what will your story be? And how will we use our story to help others who are in greater need? Our hope for today's conversation will be that we start to identify, or that you will start to identify your core gift or gifts and create your own narrative moving forward. At the end of this webinar, we will ask you to join us in a discussion or conversation to reflect on this one question that we will pose to you, and that is, what will your generation's narrative be moving forward? And so Dr. Reagans will walk us through a number of slides that will hopefully stimulate that reflection, and by the end that you will be able to participate in talking about what you perceive to be a legacy or your generation's narrative with regards to COVID-19. So with that, I will now invite Dr. Mark Reagans to start his presentation. Mark.
Thank you, Gustavo. I want to echo something Gustavo said, that today's session I would like to have a couple times along the way. Once you'll see about halfway through, and then towards the end some actual conversation on the because we're talking about the future, and my expertise kind of goes down the way because I don't know what's going to happen in the future any more than you do. All right. So if this pandemic is going to be your generation's defining moment, and it's possible something bigger is going to happen in the next decade or so, but it's not very likely, actually. This seems like a giant thing to me, between the pandemic and the recession and the demonstrations and maybe even the election things, that this is all seems like one moment to me. How will this define you? And I want to give you a little background here. Let's talk about what I mean about defining moments in the first place. So if you look back in the last century, we can say that the Great Depression was a defining moment. The people who came out of that ended up, that would alter them forever. Going through that, they like saved money for forever. They worried about their jobs. Our government changed forever after that. World War II was a defining moment for the greatest generation who came back from that. And for my generation, the 60s is a defining moment, with the civil rights and the Vietnam War protests and the culture wars we've had since. I don't think there has been a defining moment in my life as more cities since then. Some might argue that September 11th was a defining moment, but I'm not sure it really did turn the page on the things that were happening. And when you look at each of these defining moments, they have an action that was caused as a result. So in the Great Depression, we worried about whether people could actually take care of themselves or be unemployed or be starving. Both people individually made the difference in how they did it, and our government enacted a whole set of socialist programs under FDR and the New Deal. Europe did the same thing. Some places called it socialism, some places called it communism, some places just called it the Liberal Party. But there was a whole set of government helping taking care of people that it didn't exist before this great failure of capitalism. But every action has a reaction in the other direction, not necessarily equal and opposite, but it has a reaction. And in this case, the reaction against this government support and of people was from the wealthiest people who was doing well in capitalism and had factories and do things doing well, who didn't want to be taxed heavily to support making this giant safety net. And they supported leaders who helped them keep things safe, keep a strong military presence to keep the social unrest down, which ended up in many countries emerging as fascism. Most importantly, of course, in Germany, which was the most industrial of the countries and suffered probably the worst in the Depression. And they had this reaction of fascism and Hitler going back to it. That action and reaction going against each other is what sets up World War II, against these two things. World War II sets up an action that says America is going to be the leader of the world. Whether we're the policeman of the world, whether you think we're the exploiter of the world, whether you think we're the champions of democracy around the world and champions of freedom, you can see it's good or bad, but the old European empires from England and Germany and France were gone. And we were going to, our way of being supported reconstruction in Europe, in Asia, all over the world. The reaction to that was the Cold War and the Soviets and communism creating little fights all over the world and fights using the entire third world as opposition to America's dominance, which led to the Vietnam War and to the 60s. And going against that prevalent American culture as it had been, with civil rights, women's rights, war protests, youth movements, and that created this huge upheaval of that we still see both that action and the reaction of the other side saying, no, we want to go back to the values of the 50s. We want to go back to, we don't want any tolerance for people of different races or different sex or gender identity or any of these things. And you could argue Trump is one of the big representatives of the reaction to the 60s. And we've been fighting this cultural war, this action reaction from the 60s, my entire life. And even when you meet people my age, we will see almost everything within that lens. Whether it's a pandemic, we'll say, look how the Republicans are bad, the Republicans are good. We'll say with demonstrations, look how this is racist people from the South or the Republicans or Democrats. We will see it within this lens. You don't necessarily have to, but you have to turn the page if it's going to. And so is this lens of the culture wars set up our current giant crises between the pandemic, the demonstrations, and the recession that will lead to some other action, and then of course some other reaction. You can't just do things in one direction. One other comment I want to make about this being a defining moment is, my guess is the next defining moment is most likely to be something about climate change, something about us getting to a breaking point with the global warming, with the change in weathers or water or sea or something like this, the collapse of the petroleum economy, something like this will be the next defining moment. And so when we're thinking about how we'd like this narrative to go, what actions do you want to take based on what's happened here? You should be thinking to some degree of setting it up for it to have a better chance of succeeding in that next one, to face that next climate change one. So, because some of these set up things that were even worse. You could argue that getting out of the Depression by setting up World War II was even worse outcome. So that's my idea that says, this is a defining moment for your generation. What's going to be the action? What's going to be the reaction to that? And how will this perhaps set us up for the next one? Now, you all may say, wait a second, I'm young. Aren't you guys going to figure that out? We're not the ones in charge here. You guys are in charge. We're just coming of age now. And I think the group of people that come of age during a crisis is a particular impact. So I want to give another set of context here about coming of age and rituals. So in traditional cultures, there's huge rituals around initiation and coming of age, arguably more for boys than for girls, but for both sets along the way. And they have all four of my developmental levels built into these initiations. For instance, if you're a girl, do you know how to cook acorn mush? Do you know how to keep a house? Have you learned this to be able to be a good wife? Have you put together a dowry of things to be able to make your own house? If you're a boy, do you know how to go out hunting? Do you know how to earn a living to take care of this wife, the security levels? In self-efficacy, what skills have you learned? Have you gotten through your apprenticeship of things? Are you a particularly good hunter or healer or leader? What are you particularly good at? And are you connected to the other people in the adult community already? Have the elders accepted you in as part of this ritual about we are recognizing you are men or women and you're coming in and you're joining now the overall community of men and women along the way? And oftentimes there's a spiritual component of it as well. For instance, you go on a vision quest or something to find your particular name or your meaning, or have this a spirit animal or some spirits that can connect to you. It's very designed to have, by the time you're moving through initiation, there are rituals that are supported by the entire community that help you through all four of those levels so that you have a stable mental health adulthood and you're part of the community, you're part of God's world. Our current society has plenty of rituals laying around. You could even argue high school graduation's a ritual, prom's a rituals, summers abroad in Europe as a study abroad program, you could say, as a ritual. First dates are rituals, marriages are rituals, all kinds of things are rituals, but we're very fragmented. So many of them do not have nearly the same cohesiveness or meaning that they've had before. And many young people find themselves trying to find their own way, trying to find, can I take care of myself economically? What am I competent at? What is my skills? Who is going to be my adult community? How am I supposed to fit in to this world that's there? How am I going to make relationships, good business connections? And what is even my religion going to be? Am I going to go to the same church my parents did? Or will I find my own way? Am I going to start practicing new things like yoga and meditation or prayer that are maybe different than my parents were? When we have a giant crisis like we've had now, it disrupts the ongoing rituals. Graduation looked different. I went to one that was at a drive-in near me where everyone sat in their cars. We had a little parade with the graduates going by in their cars separate around the neighborhood. That did make it so that your particular group here had a set of shared unique rituals that only you will have. It's unlikely we'll ever see the set of things that just happened to celebrate your graduations and moving forward. Now, one of the key purposes of these rituals and of initiations is to help young people find what their core gift is. Now, core gift is a word that needs a little explanation. I get this from a friend of mine, Bruce Anderson. If you're interested, you can look at his website, coregift.org. And he got it from Native American cultures and from myths around the world and rituals. And the idea here is this isn't like your skills. This isn't like I'm good at math or I'm good at science, so I should be an engineer or a doctor or something. This isn't even what your talent, what your passion is. I love drawing or music, even though I can't do it very well, or I love running. This is, what are you meant to be? What makes you special and different from everybody else? What is your key purpose that you're supposed to be serving? Let me give you a few examples from some of the college students I'm with to see what happens. For instance, I asked someone, I said, so I noticed you're in a criminology major. To one woman, why are you in a criminology major? What are you doing? She said, well, I want to make sure that children are protected from abuse and from trauma in their families and from others hurting them, and justice represents them and gives them, I want to make sure they have a voice of their own. This is her own particular purpose and spot that she wants to be. Then she's feeling driven towards. Now, core gifts are often connected to core wounds. For instance, that particular girl was abused when she was a kid, and what DCS did not help, and neither did the police or anyone else. So she felt unheard and wounded and left abandoned. She wants to make sure that doesn't happen to anybody else. Now, it doesn't have to be that connected, or that obviously directly connected. Let me give it an example. I know a girl who felt like she never fit in with anybody, that she had different interests, she thought differently, she was a weird kid, she was smarter than the others, or different things, she was in her own world. She ended up studying exobiology, which is a study of life in outer space, literally life that isn't from this planet, life that doesn't fit in any way. You can see how that fits with her sense of herself and wound. I was never part of things. I'm going to go look to see, help find life that isn't part of things. It can be connected like that as well. One young man wanted to be a film maker. I said, what kind of films do you want to make? He said, stories of people who don't fit in, because he never fit in. There's these, your wound can lead to your gift. And then in two ways. One is those examples I've just showed are ones where the gift is part of overcoming your wound, trying to make sense of not being able to fit in, trying to make sense of being left to fend for yourself when you were an abused kid, trying to recover from that. But the other is your gifts can keep pushing you to do things, wounding you in ways you wouldn't have been if you would have settled. For example, I know someone who very much wanted to be a filmmaker, but they're from a Filipino family who thought they should be a nurse because that's practical, and that's what many people in their family had been. And it would have been much easier, much less wounding, to just go along and be a nurse. But something in his heart said, no, I've got to be creative. I've got to make these films. And so he ended up wounded by having to go against his family, feeling like he was a disappointment to them, feeling like he had to tear himself apart from them. He got extra wounds because he felt he had to just keep doing this. And I'll often ask people when they say they're in some struggle with their parents or people around, why do you think you keep pushing this? Why aren't you taking the easy way out and just giving up, just going along with what people want for you? What is that inside of you that says, no, I have to keep fighting for this? I need to insist that I am a non-binary sexual gender. I need to insist that I explore the world and not just stay in my own town. I need to insist that I'm going to go to college and not just be a housewife. What is it about you that insists that? Because that is your life force. That is part of your core gift. For the adults in the group, by the way, when we come from a place of sharing our own core gifts, it tends to bring out the core gifts in young people. If we think back of what a teacher does, which teachers are most influential to the kids, or which touched them the most. You say, well, it was the subject matter. Not necessarily. Even though I liked English, maybe it was a math teacher that actually touched me the most. Well, it was their style. Well, they used a lot of examples or storytelling, or they were charismatic or something. No, not necessarily. It's usually that the teacher is so passionate about the field, it comes from their spot of meaning, why this is so important to them, that it forces the children to respond, the students to respond from a place of, is this meaningful to you as well? And once you've got this going like that, that's a teacher situation, that's a parent situation, that's a counselor situation in which you get from the most meaningful spots and you're bringing out the students' core gifts and their meaning. Mentorship, there's lots of great movies, for instance, about mentors help bring out their core gift in young people by sharing theirs, and often both grow as a result in this emotional connection. You can't, this isn't just let's go through a rational discussion of write down 6 things you're good at and come with your core gift. This is an emotional process of where are your real values, where are your real drives, where is your real life force. That's why it tends to be done best in terms of ritual. All right, so we've got, let me review a second where we've gotten to. We've got, this is a time of crisis, of defining, that may lead us onto a different action reaction. You are going through your initiations at this time, the rituals, and in our culture, they're much more fragmented than they are in traditional cultures. And one of the main roles of an initiation is to come up with what your core gifts, and for the elders to help you find your core gifts and be accepted for them and be able to use them in the community. So you come out of saying, I am Little Bear, I am Lone Arrow, and this is how the community would be my role in the community. Now, I've talked about this some. We were talking about being stuck with your families last week, that until relatively recently, people grew up in ways that were determined and restricted by the conditions of their birth and the rituals and the practices from their parents and even their ancestors. You grew up and did what your father did. You were in the same village as them, your same religion as them, married someone in the same connections. You prepared for marriage in the same way. You ate the same foods. You had the same dreams and thoughts, same sexual orientation, same tolerances, same intolerances. Our culture urges young people to find your own paths, find what your dreams and talents and ambitions and gifts are, and we're only fair at supporting you in being able to do this. We tell you, oh, if you know what you really want and you really stick to it, you can have anything you want. Only if you get enough support and can make this work. Now, that's a much more difficult path than says just follow what your parents are doing. But it's potentially way more individualized and rewarding path than just do what they did. Now, where I got the title for this one is, and I think it's a good example, is the evolution of wedding vows. So in my family, when my uncle wanted to marry a girl who wasn't Jewish, this would be in the 40s or 50s maybe, this was unacceptable to his father, who went to temple and had the marriage cursed and wouldn't show up, and said, you're not part of, if you can't follow the rules, you can't be part of things, you can't belong, and you're dead to me. You have to either follow or don't follow. By my generation, in my marriage, there we could find a Unitarian minister who said, I'll marry people of any races, it doesn't matter, and I'll help you. I got some, do you have any rituals from your various traditions you want to include in this wedding? And I've got some Bible verses, and I've got some poems we can include. Let's put it to, I'll help you put it together, and I'll make this wedding for you. There was freedom to do things, but we're trying to do it within the building blocks of the rituals that were already there. By the time you get to my son, they are writing their own vows entirely. Not just their own vows, the whole ceremony. The person who officiated there was just a theology student they knew from college who did a rap show on TV. He'd never done a wedding before. And we set up so that they would tell the story of their relationship and why they were coming together and what support they need. They had to put the whole thing together. Of course, they procrastinated and did half of it at 2 a.m. the night before. It was a beautiful wedding, much more individual, much more focused, much more towards their needs and wants, but much more difficult because they had to do it exactly for themselves, writing their own vows. That same thing is happening in our culture, not just for weddings, but for every part of growing up and living. Given how complex our world is right now, how much education gets to a reasonable job, how much money it takes to get a house together, how complex dating practices are, developing your own spiritual and religious beliefs, most young people are taking many years to get to this place of collecting your own life vows and your own blood, likely your entire 20s to develop your path. By the way, that doesn't mean that the time you spent in the 20s, never mind, it's not important. Quite the opposite. That's when you are building the basis for what relationships are like for you, what kind of job skills have you built, what kind of friends you got, what kind of way do you interact sexually, what is your spiritual practices, so you build them so you have it together by the time you get to 30. But that's much, much older than it would have been in generations past. If you just do things in a traditional way, people could get married when they were teenagers. And they could go to work with their permanent job when they were teenagers, start having children as teenagers. Now, when we have a crisis, it's not that it makes new weird things happen so much as it brings out things that were always there. This quote here is from C.S. Lewis, who I assume you know from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He was writing it about World War II, saying, "War creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so we can no longer ignore it." War, it's presumably like other crises, and part of me is wondering, certainly the racial demonstrations we're seeing, these racial issues, those aren't new. They've been going on 6 years, but it has aggravated it so it can no longer be ignored. Being disconnected and isolated from each other, that's not new. We've been getting less and less socially connected. But with the pandemic, it's become aggravated, and it's hard to ignore how isolated we are and don't have connections with each other. Things about wealth inequality and privilege and its intersection with race. None of that is new, but it's been profoundly aggravated by the pandemic so that the recession and the coming, perhaps even depression, will affect certain people and certain races and certain socioeconomic scales much harsher than others. This particular time is bringing out things in us that have always been there, but we simply cannot ignore anymore. So I want to pause here and see if we can do a little discussion or commentary for things, because I've talked about a lot of kind of theoretical things, stirring things up. And the three questions to think about. So this crisis, what are the wounds that are being exposed? And by the way, in case you're interested, I wrote this slide a month ago before there were any demonstrations at all. What are the gifts that this crisis is exposing? There's been some amazing things happening with people caring for other people in ways they hadn't before. And not just for our overall country or our world. What wounds and gifts are being exposed for you personally? And are your wounds and gifts interrelated? Do they form wound-gift pairs? Are these things connected and going to be important for your life? Are the things that were always there, but are now aggravated and you simply cannot ignore them anymore? So let me pause here for a bit, and let's see if, I'm not, maybe Gustavo, you can help me with if people raise their hand, or we can unmute them, or can they unmute themselves?
Yes, you can unmute yourself and participate.
You can unmute yourself, or you can, actually, I don't have chat on my screen, so I can't see if someone's, I should have, and where'd it go? Oops, wait a minute, backwards. Anybody like to pipe in here? Nobody.
Yeah. So Mark, someone, Betty wrote, I feel like I'm going to say something wrong to make people mad. I have grown up starting with civil rights. I have a hard time not speaking up. Betty, if you want to unmute yourself and maybe expand on your question.
Well, just at my age, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so just
I can't see you though, so I don't know how old you are.
I'm old.
You're old? Okay.
I'm 69, so I grew up in the civil rights period, you know, women's rights, the whole thing. And it seems like we've been progressing with rights of women and races, et cetera, slower for some things, of course, and especially still, races and women. But if you say something now, I'm afraid I'm going to be called a racist, and I'm not. So I don't know how to get around that when you want to say something, not derogatory, just your side of the story, and then people get aggravated when you say something.
So let me let's throw that open. But I want on a couple comments. One is, so you're a little older than me. Do you think I've got it right that the '60s were our defining moment, and that we've been living in that conflict action and reaction ever since?
For me, that's hard to say. I come from a medical background, so it's hard to say. I can't answer that.
All right. My sense is, and I don't know if I'm right, and other people, please pipe in, is that this business about I can't say the wrong thing is because that page, that action, and that reaction from the civil rights has been going on so long, it's become very hardened and very hypersensitive. That we've been playing. It's like an old couple have the same argument, and you don't want to trigger each other's arguments over, and we've been in the same thing, and we haven't been able to move on from that spot to be able to explore anything anymore. Now it's just a question of you're right or you're wrong in arguing. And that's why it makes us have to be that extra sensitive, which doesn't allow any reasonable coming together perspective or growing.
I see my family, it's my brother and my niece, that are actually parting ways over this. Mm-hmm. So I'm shocked that people are tearing up their own families over what's going on now, not COVID, but the riots and the protests and etc.
So especially if we can pipe in, if any of the younger people want to pipe in, that says, do you guys have help for people of mine and Betty's generations, that we've been fighting this for so long that we just bloody each other at this point and breaks up families? Does this crisis, this pandemic, this demonstrations, give us some other way to get out of just this action reaction that we've been caught in for quite a long time?
Dr. Mark, you had brought up a couple of points about how like there's a sort of stigma associated with talking about like racial injustice, and I totally get it, but I also feel like going back to your questions, it's also kind of like it is a wound, but I also feel like it is a gift, because while one of the most concerning parts about like our time right now, one of the most concerning wounds is racial injustice, I also feel like it can be perceived as a gift, because it like indicates that people are becoming more open and more willing to talk about issues such as this that are bothering them, and are more willing to make a difference in the world and to speak up for themselves and to take charge and put their voice out there and stand up strong. So I feel like as a younger person, it's kind of a good thing, but there's also some negatives that become associated with it, like you said, from your guys' time.
So let me see if I got, and don't leave words in your mouth. That was Prishna, I assume?
Yes.
Don't let me put words in your mouth. So from your side is, the gift side is that overcoming Betty's issue of I can't say anything, to be able to speak up and talk and feel empowered to have a voice, even if I was someone who was either repressed or being blamed for repression. But the wound is that once you speak of a pain, that then you have to face it and it hurts. Am I hearing you right, Krishna, or am I not getting it right? Because I want to make sure I'm getting it your way.
Yeah, that's kind of how I'm seeing it. It is a wound, because like there's so much stigma around it, and so many people are afraid of like speaking out, because like there's a bunch of backlash that people are receiving just by saying the simplest things, and like some others taking it in a wrong direction, if you know what I mean. And so that kind of like builds a wound, like you had said. So yeah, just personally how I feel.
So on the big stage, that one's about that, is this pandemic, these demonstrations going to expand the voices in the world? And is the reaction going to be what Betty's worried about and what you're bringing up too, that, well, there's a whole lot of people who are, you're intolerant to the slightest bit of intolerance, or intolerant, they want to say that let's have more voices and let's have more judgmentalism about those voices.
Maybe we need a book on being politically correct in this time. Because, you know, it's like, you know, we've had certain things that you can't say because it's not politically correct. And I agree with that. There's been some awful things that we used to say. And if we could get a book or something that says, okay, don't say this, this is okay. Don't say this, this is okay. Just for example, and don't anybody get mad at me. Okay. My mother-in-law used to call them blackies. Okay. I grew up when they were colored, and then the N-word was used. That was a normal everyday, you know, if you were talking of a certain race, that's what my father used. I didn't use that because I started, you know, then we had Martin Luther King and we progressed. So we stopped using that because it wasn't a nice thing to say, and that came directly from the race. And so, but now I referred to somebody the other day with dark skin. And somebody said, well, that's racist. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to say? I don't know.
And I think that, actually, I'd like to hear from more people about my 2 cents on that, is that frustration is the kind of struggle that we should be having now of what are the ways to be respectful and empowering towards each other. Is it supposed to be colorblind or color sensitive? How do we welcome everyone's voices and include voices? And this has been aggravated by our current situation, so it's brought up and feels very raw to everybody as a result. And it may be that, as Christian's describing, that the page isn't so much about race and color, it's about voice and empowerment and hearing, rather than the voices being dominated by a certain set of people and a certain set of values, so the other voices simply aren't there. Mm-hmm. Or demeaned in some way. This may be about empowering and listening as much as it's about color.
Mark, let me bring in David. You want to add anything? You're going to mute yourself, Dave.
I think there's a Robert who'd like to talk.
Yeah. Robert?
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Robert.
I just wanted to point out that the situation with the protests, they didn't create Black Lives Matter. So it wasn't that the situation revealed anything that wasn't really already there. It amplified a dialogue that was already going on. It just wasn't going on in the center theater, if I can.
Yeah, that's why I like C.S. Lewis's quote there. It simply aggravated things so it could no longer ignore them. All right, let me move on to do a few more slides for a bit to get to the person. Thank you guys for your comments. So before we leave C.S. Lewis, I want to say a word about him. If you guys who are now your teenagers and students, you may think you're born at a particularly terrible time, between being born right after September 11th and then the recession and now the pandemic. Probably the worst time to be born was right about 1900. You became a teenager in World War I, where they killed off tons of them in the trenches. Then the Great Depression came, And then you end up sending your kids back to the same battles in World War II with the Nazis destroying millions and millions of people all over the world. C.S. Lewis was born in 1898. And like many of his generation, he was emotionally wounded and pretty grumpy. Like the existentialists, people like Camus and Sartre, like Dada artists, like discordant musicians. But right at the very beginning of World War II, when they started, or not at the very beginning, when they started the Battle of Britain, the bombing in London, they sent kids to the countryside, including 3 little kids came near his house. And he watched them try to grow up on their own, play without school anymore, without any of the rituals, without their friends back in the city. And inspired by them after the war, he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which if you look at it, all of us have read these. They're actually a guide for children to live in a world that has good and evil, both inside of us. Remember, like the brother Edmund would have these weaknesses inside of himself. And on the outside, there was I think Snow Queen or Snow Witch who was on the outside, that you couldn't just think you were in a naive, innocent world, but that how do you make your way? This is his path of initiation and growth of trying to mentor generations of children. And in fact, it's worked amazingly as a creative guide for generations after that. This one is Winnie the Pooh. Christopher Robin was born about 1920, and it's still 100 years later his thing. And I pulled up this slide because let's bring in mental health and let's bring in the psychiatrist and diagnosis. This is a slide that's actually, it's very popular, being passed around mental health people for quite a while. You take all these characters and you give them diagnoses. You know, Piglet's always anxious, and Eeyore's always sad, and these various characters. When I went to find this slide, it was in a report from the Canadian Medical Journal, who suggested, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that those characters have been better off with a little bit of meds and some parental guidance. We cannot help but wonder how much richer Pooh's life had been with a trial of low-dose stimulant medications. Now, we are taking distress and then labeling it as various illnesses, giving people medications, giving people parental guidance to be able to deal and cope with these things, when these is actually a child, and yes, he's mostly on his own, playing in the woods, who's playing with various parts of himself, various normal emotions, using the toys to figure out and integrate himself. Rather than demonizing any part of himself, he's integrating creatively to become a whole person. This slide came from, the one with the Eeyore came from my wife. Said one awesome thing about Eeyore is that even though he is basically clinically depressed, he still gets invited to participate in adventures and shenanigans with all his friends. They never expect him to pretend to feel happy. They never leave him behind or ask him to change. They just show him love. If you want a more modern version, if you guys saw In and Out, sadness ends up being finally accepted for her sadness, and then she draws in the compassion and helps the girl at the end to pull her life together. Every time we have a crisis, whether it's a suicide or a shooting or someone dying or something like this, we call in a small army of psychologists to help people cope with the mental fallout. We've had presentation about what the mental health things from the pandemic, and you better get treatment and better get coping skills. Maybe we don't always need mental health professions, though we can be helpful, and even our medications can help. But maybe we should be calling in an army of peers and teachers and parents and artists and even elders to help us make meaning of things, help us accept the negative things, all these various feelings, so that we can develop self-identity and connectedness. Current example would be Toy Story. Now, this is very similar in some ways to Winnie the Pooh, but the differences are interesting too. This one, Toy Story, is created by a bunch of mostly men animators at Pixar. Many of them have their own kids and all this time period that's been made. And this time, the dad, instead of being on the side just observing and having no place in it while his son is playing by himself, the dad has an alter ego in this of Woody, who's actually there, who's helping everybody else out, especially helping out Buzz Lightyear, who acts like an adolescent kid who's unrealistic and thinks he can fly and do anything, to help him be able to connect with all these other parts of him to be able to grow and navigate various things along the way. This is the kind of creativity, the kind of maps for the future, our versions of Narnia, our versions of Winnie the Pooh. One of my favorites, if you guys saw Toy Story 4, is Forky, who's perhaps most emblematic of this particular moment in time, who's handmade, but he's fearful that he's just garbage. He's not even worth living as a toy and keeps throwing himself in the trash can, that I don't have any value at all. And if we asked Forky the question that we were debating a minute ago with Betty and Krishna and me, he wouldn't be politically correct, but he would have this serious sensitivity of, oh, you're just making me trash or putting me away. How do you welcome me back? And if we look at how Woody welcomes him back, that's a real different way than our standard liberal approach to affirmative action, for instance. So, your long distance homework assignment to send you out with, and we can talk for a few minutes about it here too. If you think about creating your generation's narratives, there's 8 key questions here. What gifts and wounds do you bring to your lives? What do you got going on in your life before this ever happened? Before it got aggravated by all these things? How will the pandemic be your initiation? How will it help you find your gifts, build security, find how you fit in connectedness to other, and find meaning, and perhaps even spiritual connectedness? How will you develop as we go through this crisis in all 4 of those levels? How are you going to get your gifts to come together as part of the community? Whether you're being out there helping people to food kitchen, or out there in a demonstration, or out there bringing things to a shut-in elderly person who shouldn't be going out and getting infected. How are your gifts coming together to be part of your roles in the community? And as we all come, as your whole generation comes together, what are going to be the shared values and missions? It might not just be ours from the last crisis of civil rights and sexual rights and tolerance. It might be very different things, or another way of looking at perspective, the same things. What are you gonna, how will you respond as these various reactions happen, but to the reactions that you're gonna see opposing whatever positive changes you try to put in? What kind of leadership do you need to develop so that you can have the side of your actions be moving forwards rather than keep being pushed backwards by the reactions? And what support and mentoring do you need from us older people in order to develop that leadership to take it? It's one thing for us to say, and you hear it from, I heard from Obama the other day, oh, it's up to your generation to do things to carry forwards. Yeah, but what support and mentoring do you need from us? And certainly he's an example of someone who's trying to give a lot of support and mentoring in various ways to push things forward. But there's a difference in mentoring when we try to get you to fight our values and buy our perspectives, as opposed to we try to help nurture the gifts inside of you, the perspectives inside of you, the values inside of you, so that you can be effective leaders toward your ways of acting and reacting, rather than just carrying on our battle that we've been fighting for my entire life, the last 60 years or so. Let me stop there, see if there's a couple quick comments before we run out of time. Anyone want to pipe in?
I think there's this a slightly underlying assumption that each generation speaks with more or less a unified voice. I know as a teacher, I've been very frustrated that, when I bring up Black Wall Street or Rosewood or some of these facts of history, that are not found in the textbook, I've been seen as anti American, anti patriotic, and these things are not in our quote unquote standards. And so I become somewhat vulnerable to criticism from the administration, and this creates a dichotomy. It isn't like you've got a unified mentorship or a unified voice coming from one generation to another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me say a couple quick things, and I did see a hand up if someone else wanted to talk. I want to make sure they get a chance to. So one is that I'm going to say a couple quick things. One is you're right that I'm not making that assumption overall. I'm making the assumption that each person is likely to have their own personal gifts and wounds and their own past, because we've built such an individualized, multicultural, multi-personal society instead of a group or collective thinking, and that it's possible there will be coalescence of some of those, but that each person isn't going to believe things because they belong to some group, but because they get it from their own insides. So my initial assumption is no, they don't have a voice yet. The voice will be lots and lots of individuals that will perhaps emerge. Just like when we say, who's the leaders of these things? There isn't leaders yet. The values to come and missions first, and then the leadership will come. The other thing is, I want a word on being a teacher or mentor, is that, is to underline the last thing I said, was that when you're bringing up these things in class, be aware of when you're bringing it up to help people broaden, to see things more like yours, or to fight against what you see as a prevalent incorrect view, and when you're bringing it up because it's in response to their curiosity and their caring and what they're actually trying to pursue. Make sure we're helping them on their journey rather than recruiting them for ours. And it's particularly hard if you've been very passionate with a journey of your own along the way. I'm a very passionate liberal Democrat. And I'll give an example beyond myself. I was with my congressman is, oh shoot, her name out of my head. The black lady from the Southeast side. She's been our congressman forever. She's in the Civil Rights Hall of Fame. She and Trump are arguing all the time. Anyone can throw up the name of this?
Yvonne Burke?
No, a U.S. congressman, not but
Maxine Waters?
Yes, Maxine Waters. Thank you. So Maxine Waters, I saw her doing a session where she was trying to get young people, especially these black women or students from Cal State Long Beach, to be a part of things that involve them. But she was very much trying to get them to join her particular racial or anti-racial crusade. It's been her incredible passion, incredibly successful thing. It's very hard to actually mentor someone in their own path when you have a particularly beloved, powerful path that you've been fighting for your whole life, as Maxine has. All right, there's one more hand that I lost. Where'd it go, Gustavo? Did you see?
No, I'm not seeing.
Oh, I thought someone wanted to speak up and I lost it.
What?
Nobody? Okay, I thought there was.
So the one thing I want to just,
Okay, go ahead, pipe in.
you talked about the, in thinking about our core values, that is not something that you can just come up with by just listing, 5 things or whatever that list might look at, but that it involves engaging emotionally. What would you say to us who are in that exploratory or trying to discover what our gifts are? What can we do between now or after this webinar for us to be able to arrive to what is, or at least understanding what is our core gift or our core gifts in whatever career path we are or going into?
So there are processes for trying to explore core gifts in sort of formal ways, but it's a process of digging deeper, of whatever you say your preference is, keep pushing. For example, I think it's important to say you shouldn't force me to wear masks. All right, why is that important to you? Well, because I don't think the government should control individual liberties. I think individual liberty should take, and people have to act responsible on their own without the government forcing responsibility. Why is that important to you? Keep digging down until you get to an answer that's yours uniquely. Till you say something like, because I've seen people get pushed by the government into going along with things that ended up really harmful to everybody, and afraid to speak up because nobody would speak their own mind because they thought they would get crushed. So that's why these delivery is so hard for me. It has to get to something that's yours individually. If your answer is, I like helping people, I want to do good, that's not specific enough. Keep digging and digging and digging until it's an answer only you could give. And once it's an answer only you could give, you probably can look around and notice what the wound is that goes with it, that only you would have that wound. They're very, core gifts are very individual things. And it often has to do with your childhood along the way.
Thank you, Mark. We are at 2 o'clock, and I just want to again thank you all for being with us for these last 4 sessions. Again, these sessions will be available as a recording at our Cal-HOSA website. Mark, any last closing statements?
Just, it's been a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for those who hung out through the various ones. If you have any other thoughts or questions or comments, feel free to email or connect with us. And I hope to see how things evolve, and I hope I see you all as leaders moving things in the future. Take care, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mark.